Welcome back to the channel, everyone. It's Jacob with Martin's Woodworking. And in today's video, I'm going to show you how I made this mid-century modern media stand. This project definitely challenged me and taught me a lot of new skills. So if you'd like to follow along and learn some new skills as well, please hit that subscribe button and let's get to the build because there's a lot to do. Before we get started, I need to draw out some plans. This is something I've never shared with you before, so this is how I do it. I don't use any fancy computer software. I just use a pen and paper and draw some really terrible looking pictures, and I make a cut list of what I think I will need to cut. First, to create the trapezoid box, I need to run over to my friend Graham's shop to do this because he had a jig that would make this possible. Big shout out to him. Please give him a follow on Instagram. It will also be linked down below. I set the table saw to 40 degrees and never changed the angle once it was set. I need to make 4 cuts with the plywood and the vertical jig and 4 cuts with the plywood flat on the table as a normal cut would be. On my drawing, the parts that are labeled with the number 1 are the cuts that I made vertically, and the parts that are labeled with the number 2 are the cuts that I made with the pieces flat against the table. I'll link a few videos down below to explain this much better. As I'm cutting this, you can see the pocket holes in the plywood from its previous life, and the dimensions for this project were the top piece was 42 inches, the bottom piece was 33, the sides were 25, and everything is 16 inches wide. After all the pieces were cut, I did a quick dry fit to make sure everything lined up before I left Graham's shop. When I got back to my place, I began the glue up. For this glue up, I'm using the tape clamp method. This method is just using tape to hold everything together. I laid out the top and side pieces on the floor and glued them up first. An extra set of hands would have probably been a good idea to keep things from shifting and falling. But next I added the bottom piece and added more tape where I thought it was needed and let the weight of the project hold everything together. While the glue was drying, I began figuring out the location for the partition. I really liked the offset look. It's almost a 1/3 to 2/3 ratio split of the cabinet. With that decided, I knew I wanted the doors on the smaller side and the open shelves on the larger side. All that was left was to figure out the shelves, and I tried to split that in half from top and bottom. To make the shelves, I cut the angle side of the shelf to 10 degrees off of 90 on the table saw. Because my trapezoid box is 80 degrees, I knew all I needed was 10 degrees for that angle. Once I was happy with the angle, I set the saw back to 90 degrees, and cut the shelf to size until the shelf fit about in the center of the box, and I repeated the same process for the other side and attached the shelves using pocket holes and made sure everything was level as I installed them. With all the pocket holes in this project, I used DAP Plastic Wood X all-purpose wood filler to fill in all the pocket holes. I'm going to be painting the plywood, so this will work great to hide all these holes and imperfections. And honestly, if I never showed you that I used pocket holes or that the plywood had a previous use before this project, you would have no idea that I used this method to attach the shelves. With the shelves in place and the holes filled, I began sanding down the pocket holes and the front and the back of the project to make sure things were level for the next step in the project, which will be the face frame. I'm using rough milled walnut for this project, and when I cut the rough milled edge off the lumber that I will be using for the legs and the doors, I cut it just a little thicker than normal and used those pieces to be my face frame. With all the pieces cut, I ran them through the planers to flatten the rough cut edge and to get them all the same thickness, and they all finished around 1/4 inch. Once all the face frame pieces were milled up, I could begin gluing them to the plywood. The plywood is 3/4 inch thick and my face frame pieces are right around 1 inch thick. Once again, I used the tape to clamp things down while the glue was drying, and I did my best to make sure each piece was covering the plywood evenly and that my angles were cut as accurately as possible while gluing everything together. When the glue was dry, I got to try something new to me. This was my first time using a flush trim bit and a router, and during this project I gained lots of experience using it. I just used a Diavolo 1/2 inch by 1 inch bit from Home Depot, and it worked great for everything in this build. I took my time when doing this and made sure to make small passes to prevent any tear out. Now that the cabinet is done, I can turn my attention to the legs. I drew out the designs for the legs on 1/4 inch MDF using a straight edge and a speed square. I knew I would have to use 3 pieces of wood to make these legs, and I figured the long top piece would be one and the legs themselves would be the other 2. I put my template next to my project to get a visual and quickly decided that the long piece didn't need to be as wide as I had first drew it. When I was happy with the design, I took a marker out and made the correct lines for cutting. I cut out the shape of the template on the bandsaw, and I actually didn't cut anything from the top side because I used the manufactured edge of the MDF as a straight edge. And with the template cut out, I used a sander to fine tune the template. Now that the template is complete and I'm happy with the design, I began to rough cut some lumber to size for the legs. With the pieces cut, I marked out my lines for dowels, being sure I want it cut into that area when I cut the wood to match the template. I used my dowel jig and cut 2 dowels into each leg. I used a total of 8 dowels for this. I glued up both sets of legs and let them dry overnight. With the glue dry the next day, I began the process for shaping the legs. To do this, I will attach the template to the leg using double-sided tape. This is my first time using a template, so I'm pretty excited to get to the finished result. The next step is to cut as close to the template as possible without cutting the template itself. I did this step on the bandsaw. The final step is using the flush trim bit to make the legs the exact same shape as the template. Make sure to set the bearing against the template itself, and then just like on the face frame, take small passes to remove the material until all the material is removed and flush with the template. Then I removed the template with a flathead screwdriver, being careful not to break the template. Then I repeated these same steps on the next leg. This made a terrible mess, but it was so worth it knowing that both these legs are exactly the same. This next step might not be necessary depending on the lumber you have. My lumber was rough cut lumber that was air dried for many years, and it has some damage from bugs, so I needed to fill some of these bug holes with some epoxy. With the epoxy cured, I sanded down all the leg pieces. I sanded up to 120 grit because I will be using Rubio Monocoat to finish this project, and that's what the label says to do. I marked out on the base of the cabinet where I wanted the legs to be, then cut the braces that go between the 2 legs to size and attached them to the leg using glue. To attach the legs to the base of the cabinet, I'm going to be using L brackets that I will later spray paint black. I centered the legs and put the brackets where I wanted, marked out the holes with a pencil, and pre-drilled all the holes for the screws. With all the screws attached, it was time for the moment of truth. Let's see how level and strong these legs are that I had just built. It was nice to see that they worked great, and I'm pleased with the design. So I have this video here of me sanding to show you how I made the templates for the doors. These doors will be inset doors, so I need to have them be a perfect fit in the shape of the opening. I just laid the cabinet on the front and traced out the opening with a marker. I traced them in the same spot to use less MDF. Now that I know the size of the doors, I can begin finding lumber to glue up to make the panels for the doors. To make sure these doors are perfectly flat, I'm going to be using my flattening sled for my planer. This step probably won't be necessary if you have lumber that's already surfaced on all 4 sides. This is just part of the process when using rough milled lumber. To do this, I'm going to shim the board until it doesn't rock anymore. To hold the shims and the board in place, I'm going to be using hot glue. Next, I send the sled through the planer, marking lines with a pencil between passes to make sure I know when the board is having all the material removed evenly. And that would mean it's ready to be removed from the sled. I use a chisel to pop the board off the sled and remove any of the hot glue. Then continue to run the board through the planer on the opposite side until the material is being removed evenly. Now that the door panels are flat, I can repeat the same process that I did to make the legs. Cut out the template and sand the template to make it perfect, then attach the template using double-sided tape, and cut out the door as close as possible to the template, then use a flush trim bit and the router. I told you I'd get lots of experience with the flush trim bit during this project. Money well spent. I was a little nervous the entire time making these doors because I needed them to fit exact, so I was really excited to see them fit pretty much perfect with enough space to allow for the hinges to work correctly. Alright everyone, so we're going to install these hinges I got, and to do this we need to figure out where we want them to be. So I went ahead and already figured out kind of where I wanted them. I decided that this was a good even spacing for me, and that means I need to measure down on my door 2.5 inches. So I measure down and measure up from the bottom, and then for the spacing, this spacing requires it to be 7/8 to the center of the hinge. 7/8 to the center here. So I just took my glue gauge here, moved it to 7/8 and then put it here and drew my line, and same thing down here. Then we will drill the holes and get this result, and the hinges fit right in there. I used a Forstner bit to drill a hole for the hinges, only going as deep as needed for the hinges to fit flush. My doors are 7/8 of an inch thick, but these hinges are for normal 3/4 inch lumber, so they should work good with any 3/4 inch door. Then I attached the hinges using a straight edge to make sure that both hinges were lined up together correctly. To line up the hinges on the cabinet itself, I attached everything to the hinges on the door. Then I set the door on a small spacer. An extra set of hands would be good to hold the door while you marked the location for the holes with the pencil. When I had all the holes marked, I removed the door and pre-drilled some holes for the screws, making sure not to drill all the way through the plywood. Then I attached the cabinet part of the hinge hardware to the cabinet, leaving them a little loose. Alright, so we're going to attach these hinges now, and I learned from before that I need to leave these just a little loose to give myself some wiggle room, but it should just slide on here and then pull the tab and it should click in. Sorry for any loud noises. So I got that one, just pull the tab, see it fall in. This one, close, there it goes, pull the tab, falls in, now the door is in place. Then I can come back and tighten the screws. With the hinges in place, I used the adjustment screws and got everything spaced evenly. It was really nice to see the project coming together. When I was done enjoying the successful accomplishment of getting the hinges attached, I removed the hinges and marked them 1 through 4, so when I reattach them after finishing, I know everything will line up the same. I sanded the doors down after removing the hinges. On all the walnut pieces, I did wet the grain after sanding with 120 grit. Then after wetting, I sanded again with 120 grit once it had dried. After sanding, I wiped down all the wood with mineral spirits to prepare for the finishing process. Mineral spirits helps remove any sawdust left behind, and it also gives me a preview of how the wood will look with finish on it. I will be using Rubio Monocoat to finish all the walnut pieces in this project. Rubio Monocoat is a 3-to-1 mixed ratio, 3 parts Rubio and 1 part accelerator. I'm using 2 separate syringes to mix this product, and I'm mixing a small amount at a time to make sure not to waste any product. I drizzled on the finish and used a scraper to help spread it around, and I used a towel where it wasn't possible to use the scraper to spread the product. I let the product soak in for a few minutes, and then I buffed off the rest using a clean towel. I made sure to work in areas that I could apply the product and remove the product in a 15-minute window. When the Rubio had dried, I painted the cabinet. This is the same color blue that I used on my concrete entryway bench. I'll make sure to link to that video above. I really do like how the walnut and this blue look together. I taped off the walnut face frame so I didn't get any paint on it. I needed to apply 2 coats of paint to the plywood, but when it was all dry, I attached the legs using this handy 90-degree DeWalt drill bit. With the legs attached, I flipped the cabinet over and painted everything else. I applied 2 coats of paint on the rest of the cabinet, and on the second coat I made sure to leave a very smooth brush lines to allow the paint to dry evenly and prevent it from showing any brush lines. Then I removed the tape and took a moment to enjoy what I had just built. Once the paint had completely dried, I reattached the doors and hinges. I'm honestly very proud of how this turned out. If you stuck with me to the end, you will remember that this plywood was once a different project, and I was able, with the help of friends, to turn it into this mid-century modern TV stand. I learned a lot of new skills during this build, and it tested my patience. This took me a couple weeks to build, lots of time after work and on my weekends. But now I have a beautiful piece of furniture to display in my living room and a fun story to tell about how it was built. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you on the next build.